Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, everyone, depending on where you are joining us from around the world. Welcome to the 16th webinar of the Embracing Global Markets series, organized by the Enterprise Europe Network team here at the European Commission. My name is Eric Amaral Garcia, and I'm part of the EN team in DG Grow, which is the Directorate General for Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship, and SMEs. I will be moderating today's webinar. Here in Grow, we work closely with the EN team in ESMEA, the executive agency for the European Innovation Council and SMEs, which is in charge of the operational implementation of the network. Through this series, our goal is to help European SMEs and business stakeholders better understand regulation and how to access new markets and collaborate with businesses abroad through internationalization efforts, with a particular focus on Asia, Africa, and the Americas. So before we begin, I would like to provide you with some housekeeping rules. The webinar is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube as well. So afterwards, you will be able to rewatch this webinar on the EN website as well. Please make sure your microphone is always turned off throughout this session. And kindly submit any questions you may have via the chat, either on WebEx or in the YouTube comment sections. Today's session is a bit special as it focuses on carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, which is a very relevant regulatory development with regards to global trade and internationalization strategies. So I'm very pleased to welcome today's guest, Martin Becker. He's Deputy Head of Unit in DG Taxud, the European Commission's Directorate General for Taxation, Customs and Customs Union, Martin's unit is responsible for economic and risk analysis of the EU CBAM and leads the work on the CBAM carbon accounting methodology. Martin's presentation will be structured in 3 blocks, so we will pause briefly after each of these to take a few questions, so please don't hesitate to start submitting them already at any time in the chat, and then I will be raising them to Martin. So without further ado, I will now hand the floor over to Martin for his presentation. Martin, thanks a lot for being with us today, and I give you the floor now.
Yes, hello, Eric, Thomas, and hello to everyone. Thanks for having me. Yes, so I was asked to give a presentation on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and I'm happy to do so. Given that the audience is probably quite diverse, we have discussed to have a presentation structured around 3 blocks that I would like to. I'm trying now to share the slides, which I hope are visible and now in full screen. And depending on your background and interaction so far with CBAM, some sections may be less relevant and some may be more relevant for you. I will try to be relatively brief in my presentation, also to allow for questions and discussions afterwards. So the first block will be to explain really the key objectives and main features of the CBAM for those of you in particular that have not so far been much in touch with this piece of regulation, to explain the motivation and obviously the core functioning of it. Then in a second block, a shorter block, I will explain some of the elements that are currently under discussion in Council, so among member states and in the European Parliament. So we are currently in a stage where we are discussing a CBAM simplification proposal, which comes off as part of the overall effort of the Commission to cut down on red tape across various pieces of legislation, including the CBAM. And then in the third block, I will briefly sketch out the main milestones that are ahead of us in terms of developing the CBAM further. So let us briefly recall the context in which the CBAM was proposed. That was a Commission proposal in 2021 as part of what was then branded the Fit for 55 proposal that came with a set of measures to deliver on the European Green Deal, so the EU's objective to decarbonize the EU and move towards the 2030 and 2050 objectives of the European Union. And one of the elements of this package was a strengthening and reform of the EU ETS. The EU ETS is the EU's carbon pricing system. Other jurisdictions across the world use, instead of ETS system, carbon taxes, but the basic idea is to put a price on carbon emissions so as to give market incentives to producers in the EU to decarbonize. The EU ETS is, I think, widely seen as a success, but there are risks associated to such measures in general, to climate measures, climate policies, but in particular to the ETS, and that is the link to the term or the concept of carbon leakage. So the big risk that you have if at a national level or at a supranational level, such as in the EU, you do climate policies, there's a risk that these are undermined if instead of reducing emissions by decarbonization, the production, for instance, is shifted to other jurisdictions outside of the zone where this carbon pricing scheme is applicable. That then would undermine the environmental objective. So to put it very bluntly, the disastrous outcome would be if you put a climate policy into place, and then it just means that you have less production in the Union, and all this production is replaced by production that moves abroad or by imports from abroad. And in the past years, I mean, this is not a new phenomenon or new problem as such. And in the past, in the last decade, the ETS had in itself a mechanism to prevent or to reduce the risk of carbon leakage, which were the so-called free EU ETS allowances. So just again, briefly, this is not a session about the ETS, but in the ETS, you basically have to buy allowances for emissions that you want to emit, and certain industries that are considered at risk of carbon leakage would get a certain share based on a formula, a certain share of their allowances for free. So that was a way to tackle the risk of carbon leakage. Now, with the increased climate ambitions as part of the European Green Deal, and that also follow from the Paris Agreement, one assessment was that we need, for certain industries at least, increase our ambition, and that would come also with an increased carbon price for these industries. And there, the assessment was that the existing tool to prevent against the risk of carbon leakage was not sufficient. And here comes the carbon border adjustment mechanism that indeed is put into place to prevent carbon leakage and thereby reinforce the ETS. And that is our way of contributing to decarbonization globally and to reaching the EU's climate neutrality objective by 2050. How does CBAM do this in, again, very general terms, not too technical, but happy to be more technical if questions on this arise. I said that the CBAM is strictly linked to the ETS. So it's about carbon leakage that is induced from the ETS. And the idea is that we would mirror on imports to the European Union the carbon pricing that is applicable in the Union. So to try to make it so, and it's not that straightforward, and the devil is in the detail, and there are complications in that, but the basic idea is to say, if I import a certain good that is in scope of the CBAM, the carbon price that is applicable to that good, to the production of that good in the European Union should also be applicable to the import of that good. That's the basic idea. We have designed it in a way that is aligned with the international commitments of the European Union in terms of climate policies, but also the legal commitments that we have, including the WTO compatibility, which is often a big question mark. But clearly, the CBAM is designed in a full WTO compatible way. In this first phase, and I will come to that later, we focus on specific carbon-intensive sectors and also certain products in these sectors. And I will speak about in the next steps how we will take this further. And we have two provisions therein that are key in our view to set the right incentives across the globe, and also to maintain the compatibility with the WTO compliance. That is two things. The one thing is, and that is more, it's an aspect that is relevant for countries. If a country from which products are imported into the European Union has a carbon pricing system in place, this carbon price is going to be deducted from the CBAM obligation, which is applicable upon import. And just for the argument's sake, in the extreme scenario, and for instance, imports from the United Kingdom are a good example there, where the carbon price is more or less at the same level as the EU carbon price, then that would lead then to a zero CBAM obligation. The idea is not that we want to collect money, and we certainly don't want that there's a double carbon price. We just want to make sure that there are no disadvantages for EU producers when they embark on their decarbonization strategies. But we take account of similar system as the EU ETS abroad. A second important element for the CBAM is that we don't address it to countries, which is often misunderstood. We say it is addressed to companies. More specifically, we may say it's addressed to goods. And that means that individual producers abroad can respond to CBAM by investing in decarbonization, and they would benefit from that investment specifically because the lower emissions of their greener installations and their greener production processes will be taken into account in the calculation of the CBAM obligation, and therefore this will benefit individual investment into decarbonization by companies across the globe. So that's a very different concept from something that was also debated at some time, that you would say a good is treated in a certain way if it is imported from a certain country. But then we would not have the distinction between someone that is very green, producing a very modern plant in country X versus a very old and therefore dirty plant in the same country. Suffice it to say, for practicality reasons, we will also provide the possibility, if actual emission data is not obtainable, to use country-specific averages that are computed by the European Union. What are the sectors in scope? And that is, I should say, a not too long list for the time being. We have cement, iron, steel, aluminum, fertilizers, as well as electricity and hydrogen in scope. These were selected on the basis of three criteria. The one being the high risk of carbon leakage, that is speaking about high carbon emissions and high levels of trade. If a good is not very often traded, it's very local, it's not as prone to carbon leakage risk as a good that is very easily transportable. A second, and that's also linked, of course, to the share of greenhouse gas emissions on the UTS. And the third dimension that is very important to us is the practical feasibility. It sounds maybe for the uninformed, for someone, let's say like me 5 years ago, when I was not at all dealing with these kind of matters, my background is in economics, it doesn't sound too complicated to monitor embedded emissions in an installation and translate that into goods. But in practice, this is quite complicated, actually, and specifically if we speak about more complicated products that have several inputs, that have longer supply chains, possibly across countries, across installations. And that's the reason why we have started with a quite limited scope in terms of sectors, but also in terms of products. That is that we have focused so far on quite basic products where they are not semi-finished or finished. So we're not at the moment, there's no door of the car in the scope, or a washing machine, or these type of products. We're speaking of products that are relatively upstream in the supply chain. very briefly on this, because I suppose that gets a bit too technical, but there are different emissions that could be considered, of course, for all products we consider direct emissions, so that are generated at the actual production of that good. Indirect emissions as it concerns input materials. So if I produce a CBAM good and I use another CBAM good as an input, these emissions are also to be accounted for. And then for some sectors, that is cement and fertilizers, we also take into account indirect emissions. Indirect emissions in the form of electricity consumed in the production. I skipped this slide in the interest of time. This is an important slide. I spoke about free EU ETS allowances at the beginning, and that this is the current instrument used to protect against carbon leakage. And we're not, like, from one day to the other reversing this and replacing the free EU ETS allowances with the CBAM. Rather, from 2026 onwards, when the CBAM starts to apply with a financial adjustment, we will gradually, over time, over almost a decade, replace, phase in the CBAM and phase out the EU free allowances. And that is, I try to explain in a simplistic and simplified graphic here. The way this works is, in the example is 2028, and for the more expert people among you in the audience, excuse me that this is now not 100% precise, but it's more to get the general idea. In 2028, we still have, as you see here, we have a 10% phase-in of CBAM. That means we have still maintained 90% of these free allowances. The free allowances are expressed in tons of emissions that are covered by these allowances. And this you see on the left side, that is 90% of the EU benchmark, which is a value in terms of CO2 emissions, are covered by the free allocation. So we see here three different imports on the right side. And the first one, you see that the bar goes above the red line. And the red line is the sort of the level of emissions that is covered by free allocation. And it's only the emissions above this benchmark in the year 2028 that are then at the stage of the phase-in covered by the CBAM, and therefore only on this part of the emissions a CBAM has to be paid. Over time, of course, by 2034, the phase-in will be complete, and then the red bar is at zero, and for all emissions, the CBAM price has to be paid. But there are also these examples for the year 2028 on the right, where two producers are green or as green as the top performers in the European Union, and the embedded emissions in these products are relatively low. That is at the level of the red bar or lower. And in these cases, in the year 2028, there is no CBAM obligation to be paid yet. So that's, in a nutshell, the CBAM construction and the key objectives. Unless there is a concrete question right now, I would move to the second step, but maybe we can also pause here. I don't know, Eric, what you prefer.
Yes, we have a question that I could raise to you right now, and we could do the same for the other sections. It comes from Cristina Balan from EN Romania. How much of EU's aspirational climate policies and emission reduction goals would stay valid after the omnibus? Then is CBAM affected by the omnibus? If yes, in which way?
I mean, the question is very pertinent, because that's basically what I would talk about now in the second block.
Exactly.
So unless there's another question, then I would answer the question by moving to the second block. Or is there another?
Yes, we have a new one now. From Rama, where can we get the level of free allowance for each industry?
So on this question, and it's a very important question. So there is, and I don't know by head, but the EU ETS benchmark, which is the basis upon which the free allocation are determined for EU industries is published, I suppose, on the website of DG Klima. There is an important step though that is yet to be made, which is these benchmark values that are calculated for the purpose of the EU ETS are calculated on the basis of installations, because the and then I go back to the slide maybe briefly, because that's a complication that we have in the CBAM and this link with the ETS. The CBAM is in a certain way an extension or some kind of external arm of the ETS, but there's a fundamental difference in the administration of the two instruments, because the ETS is applicable to installations, so production sites. And there's a limited number that are under the scope of the ETS, and that's how emissions are monitored, and that's how the calculation of all relevant parameters, for instance, the EU ETS benchmark, are geared towards. The CBAM, however, as I said, is a regulation that applies to products, to the individual import of a product that may have seen several installations. And that creates difficulty in several ways to, on the one hand, stay as closely as possible to the concepts of the ETS for WTO reasons, but then for practical reasons, align these rules or adapt these rules to a world in which they are applicable to products and not to installations. And now to the question, already these benchmarks in terms of free allocation in principle and as such exist for the EU ETS. There's one step missing for the context of CBAM, is to translate these benchmark values for the specific CBAM products. And that is something where the Commission is yet to publish, and this is going to be happening only in the second half of this year, to publish these values, as this is not like it's a complex endeavor to get from these installation values to the product values. And so we are yet to finalize the sort of the analytical underpinning and then to publish these values. But I understand that for many traders, this is a very important piece of information, because it will determine to quite a significant extent the CBAM obligation that they will be facing in the years 26 following. Maybe then I move to the next block.
Yes.
I mean, we can also come back to some of the questions because the next two blocks are not too long. But let me maybe take the question before I start then, I mean, in parts at least. So yes, the CBAM was part of the first omnibus actually, which concerned a variety of pieces of legislation that are related to the Green Deal or sustainability requirements. And one thing that we just collectively, I think, that deal with CBAM, be it on the side of the Commission, national authorities, or traders and third country producers, have to have in mind is the EU CBAM is the first CBAM in the world. I mean, yes, there is one in California, but it's a very specific one only for electricity. What I mean to say is there is no blueprint to cover from. There is not decades of experience in the implementation. And that means this transitional period that we had from the entry into force in 2023 until end of this year was a collective learning exercise. And many things that we have put together with member states in the European Parliament agreed upon in 2022 and 3, well, was in then when we did the reality check, not maybe put perfectly well. And so what we try to do is, based on the learnings, already ahead of the entry into force of the definitive period, which we call the part of the CBAM when importers have to start paying upon the emissions embedded in the goods, to simplify some elements. And we are convinced that we could do this, and I explain you how, in a way that does not undermine at all the environmental objective of the CBAM. Rather, I would argue to the contrary, it will make it certainly more efficient and probably also more effective in delivering on its objectives. So there are three blocks of measures in this February omnibus package in which the CBAM simplification proposal was included. The first one is a simplification for small CBAM importers. I have a second slide on this, so I will skip this here. But one key issue that we identified is the number of very small quantities of imports per importer that are at the current stage in scope, and that would be then confronted with the CBAM obligation and also the compliance burden that comes with it. And we have proposed a new sort of de minimis threshold exemption. But I again have a second slide on this. Then we have also introduced simplifications for what we call large CBAM importers, so those CBAM importers that will be in scope still after this new de minimis threshold will be in place. And there we have proposed simplification, streamlining of the authorization procedure, certain facilitations in terms of the way emissions are calculated, and certain other simplifications in the way the financial liability is established. But again, all these changes are at marginal at best in terms of reducing the environmental impact and have major benefits in terms of reducing administrative costs. And that's obviously a balance that we always need to keep. I mentioned that at the beginning. We want to have an impact in terms of decarbonization and in terms of climate objectives, but we need to keep the administrative burden, the compliance burden that comes with it at a proportion, at a reasonable level. And clearly we, in our self-assessment, have identified areas where there was scope of simplifying without undermining the objectives. A third block is just naturally when you simplify and specifically when you introduce something like a de minimis threshold, this may create some incentives for abuse, for circumvention practices. So as a third block, to have an effective CBAM, we also included in the simplification proposal a couple of anti-abuse provisions to be sure that there is no risk in terms of circumvention. Now, this slide, I think, in a nutshell, tells the story about this de minimis threshold, which is, we believe, and also that's a perception we get both from member states, parliament, and also from the industry, a very, very important simplification. At the moment, if there was no change in terms of legislation, there's only de minimis exemption for imports at consignment level, so at import sort of shipment level of 150 euro. And that's the only de minimis threshold that is currently in place. And that has led to a situation where we have an estimated 200,000 importers in scope of the CBAM. And many of these 200,000 are actually importing maybe once, twice per year, something that costs 200 euros, but in the grand scheme of things, when we speak about decarbonization, don't really matter. And with this in mind, we have now proposed to introduce or replace that shipment-based threshold with an annual threshold of 50 tons of mass of imported goods in the 4 material sectors per importer per year. You may ask why mass and not emissions. The idea was that for these small importers, we just want to make it as simple as possible to comply with CBAM, or to know that they don't have to comply with CBAM. And they know, because they lodge an import declaration, they know they have to indicate the quantities of imports. And so they know, without learning anything about CBAM, whether or not they are below the threshold and therefore exempted, around the threshold and therefore should be careful, or above the threshold and therefore need to comply with CBAM. And the effect of the simplification would be that we reduce the number of importers from an estimated 200,000 to below 20,000. So we can exempt 50 tons mass. Yes, in weight, in kilos, in tons. Sorry, not tons. So that's the mass, indeed, not emissions. We reduce the number of importers in scope to around 10%. So we can exempt 90% of the importer, which is a huge number, and we lose less than 1% of, I mean, all of this is obviously estimates, but in our estimates, we lose less than 1% in terms of emissions, which is, I mean, I said that in several meetings before, this is absolutely no-brainer as a case to make. It's evident. It's also shown on the right-hand side, and you find all these numbers in the staff working document that was published by the Commission. That we estimate cost savings, notably on the side of these small businesses, of more than 1 billion per year, and we lose in terms of revenue that are corresponding to these emissions that we cut out, around 20 million euro in 2030, which is a marginal amount compared to the benefits. So that's the CBAM simplification proposal, currently under discussion in Council and Parliament, with the hope to conclude these negotiations between the two co-legislators as soon as possible, so that this simplification and the other simplifications can enter into force before the end of the year, and therefore before the definitive period of the CBAM kicks in. And with that, I pause, and if there are any questions, happy to take them.
Yes, thank you. There is one quite articulated question on a real scenario. Maybe I can raise it to you, although it might be too technical. It's from Jurga. So real scenario. We have a plant in Slovakia which purchases materials, including steel, in Europe from distributors. Materials could be coming from Asia, but we do not purchase directly from China. The site is not an importer. The site is a manufacturer of metal stamping and fabrication products. Customer is looking for CBAM information on the two products they purchased in Q1 of 2025. Customer is based in Ukraine. Value of products in Q1 is 170,000 euros. Do we need to calculate CBAM? If yes, how? Products are made from different materials, including steel.
So that's a very long question.
Yes.
So I mean, I would propose, because sorry, I mean it may be easier for me to get back to you on this. I mean, after the meeting, because I'm now have to. I mean, because it seems to be a very particular construction, and I'm not entirely sure that I got all the elements right. So maybe if there's a possibility to follow up with Yoga afterwards, I think that's easier.
Great. We have another question that came in from Ivsen. EU plans to receive the financial support from EU decarbonization funds received from ETS tax. Will foreign third installations receive the support on decarbonization projects from CBAM tax?
There is no, I mean, it is not, I think, I mean, I shouldn't speak too explicitly about the UTS because, which is not a tax, by the way, because that's not in my remit, but my understanding is not that there is sort of a legal earmarking of UTS revenues for the decarbonization fund, but I would have to double check this. But in general, there are issues with budgetary rules where earmarking for specific purposes are not possible. So they generally either go to national budgets or the European budget if the source of revenue is identified as an own resource, which is not yet the case for the CBAM. In general, there is a question on CBAM revenue that is yet to be answered because the Commission has made a proposal that the carbon border adjustment mechanism or revenue of it should become an own resource, which is a term which may not be understandable, which is revenue that goes to the EU budget as opposed to the national budgets. At the moment, the European Union has, in principle, one traditional own resource, which are customs levies, and then also two other own resources that come from VAT revenue collected by member states and a plastic contribution. So on the use of CBAM revenue, there is no decision yet. What I should say, two things, maybe one thing which is important to keep in mind, the estimated revenue from CBAM is very low and certainly very low compared to the support in terms of technical assistance, financial assistance that the European Union gives. The estimated CBAM revenue for 2030 is around 2 billion per year, and that's obviously a fraction of what the EU spends in terms of financial support, and certainly in terms also of technical assistance we are giving to countries in their decarbonization efforts. I should also say, and I come to that in the next section, there is an assessment to be done in particular on the impact that the carbon border adjustment mechanism has on developing countries, and in particular least developed countries. And around that, there are also, of course, questions what can be done or might be done or should be done in terms of supporting, in particular, least developed countries affected by CBAM in their decarbonization efforts.
Thank you, Martin. We have other two questions. One from Lina from GBI India. Has the EU thought of using an AI tool to calculate CBAM? How are companies supposed to calculate?
So no, I mean, so far we have not. I don't think, or we don't think that AI is mature enough to be the solution to this problem. So maybe to be clear in terms of this construction, it's not the importer that has to calculate anything. What will happen is that producers across the world, which is already the case in the European Union, but also in several partner countries, producers that have industrial production sites monitor the emissions that arise at their production site. So that's third country producers that would have to do this, and then comes and they're clear. I mean, there are guidelines that the Commission has produced and rules that are published on how to do that. Then, and that's the next step, and that will only start from the definitive period. There will be also a verification of these emissions calculations. So verifiers that already do this and similar things across the globe will visit installations across the globe to verify that the data that this producer has given are accurate. So and with this system, we believe that the question on how the emissions are to be calculated are settled. So it's not going to fall on the importer. There may be cases, for instance, when an importer is importing from a small installation, or there are other issues in the exchange between the importer and that producer, where it's not possible to obtain actual emission data. And for these cases, there is the possibility to use, instead of actual emission data, just what we call a default value. So a value that is computed by the European Commission and published and publicly available, that has per product an average emission intensity per country from which it's imported, and that could be a fallback option if there's a difficulty to obtain actual emission data.
Thank you. We have questions that keep coming in. I will read the next one. If the importer bring less than 50 tons of CBAM subjected materials a year, is there still a requirement to create a CBAM profile and submit an empty quarterly report?
No. I mean, first of all, there is not, I mean, the quarterly report that exists at the moment will not continue to exist. That was just a feature of the transitional period ongoing. From 2026 onwards, We will move to an annual reporting period. So the reports are to be, the whole life cycle is annual, and then the deadline, we have proposed to have the deadline for the surrender of the certificates to, I think in the Commission proposal, it's end of August of the following year. So for the emissions of goods imported in 2026, in 2027, you would have to surrender the certificates. Now, but on your question, for these importers that are below 50 tons of mass, they don't have to do anything CBAM specific anymore. That's the whole idea, to get them completely out of the CBAM world. The only thing that they have to do is, as part of the customs declaration that they have to lodge, they have to tick a box where they say, I'm a small importer and therefore I can import CBAM goods without being a registered CBAM declarant. And that's the only thing that they have to do, plus, of course, making sure that they comply with this threshold of 50 ton.
Thank you. We have 3 other questions. Maybe we take these quickly and then we pass to the next section because we only have 18 minutes. So the next one is from Victor, and he's asking about any insights on when the CBAM benchmarks are expected to be published. And does the EU portal for third country operators allow trading companies to upload factory information operated by subcontractors? This would be for exporters who do not want to reveal their supply chain, but still want to give access to their clients to the EU portal to gather operators.
So on the first question, I cannot be, I said second half of this year, and I cannot be much more precise right now. And on the second question, I would, again, that seems to me very, I mean, I'm not sure that I know the answer, so I would prefer, given that this is now recorded and all, to follow up on this to make sure that I don't spread misinformation on this. It may be, the answer may be a simple yes, but it may be that this is a specific case where the answer is a bit more complicated, and then I would prefer, if there's a way of making, of following up afterwards, I'm happy to do that.
Sure. Next one is, does the EU plan to implement Article 7 to delay CBAM to Ukraine due to war?
And there's, that's way above my pay grade to have to say anything on this matter in this format.
And the last one is your question, will you be producing a simple guide fact sheet on CBAM?
So I'd say, well, simple is, that's probably a matter of taste and definition and whatever, but there is on the CBAM website, and I normally one finds this relatively easily via Google or alternative search engines. There is a ton of information, webinars, guidance documents. Actually quite useful, I felt, because very openly, there are certain elements that when I joined this file, I'm not an engineer, I don't have this technical knowledge in certain cases, so I watched these webinars that were, I felt, quite helpful in understanding many of the technical elements. So there's a number of videos on that are online that goes quite detailed through specific elements, for instance, the CBAM methodology. There are guidance documents, and we will continue, of course, to provide these. These guidance documents that are out there already are primarily geared towards the compliance now in this transitional period. We will, of course, now accelerate in the remainder of this year the guidance provided in forms of webinars, trainings, and also in terms of sort of distributable documents like PowerPoints or similar towards what is to be done for importers from 2026 onwards. One reason why we have not been more active right now is partly workload, partly simply the fact that we have the simplification proposal in council and in parliament for negotiations, and many of the questions in terms of guidance that we give to operators will be answered differently, whether the co-legislators decide to follow our proposal or not. And so that is why certain of the guidance is a bit later than initially, because if we were to give you guidance now on the basis of the current legal text, this would be much more complicated, presumably, than the guidance that we can give you, provide you, hopefully from somewhere onwards, when there's more clarity on the rules from next year onwards.
Thank you, Martin. I think we can move to the next section, and then if we have time, we take the other questions that are coming in.
Very good. So next steps. In the timeline, I referred to several times to this transitional period, which was ongoing, and I realized I did not really introduce that as a concept at the beginning. For those of you that have not now derived it from what I said, the CBAM as such, as a piece of legislation, entered into force in October, I think, 23, for a transitional period, which was a period that was used to collect data and information, to test the system, to get acquainted with the system, and of course to have these learnings that helped us to simplify already now, or propose to simplify the CBAM regulation. This transitional period is ongoing and will end at the end of this year. And then from 26 onwards, the so-called definitive period starts. The term definitive is maybe not very precise, because many things will evolve, and I come to that now, but this is the period from which onwards importers of goods in scope have to comply with CBAM, including, where applicable, paying a CBAM financial adjustment. So where we now, in fact, we are in April, yes, still in April 2025. 2 months ago, the Commission made this proposal to simplify CBAM that I talked about briefly, which is currently being discussed. There were also recently in the European, I think, Steel and Metals Action Plan is the title, a couple of announcements and changes in the timeline of the next steps for CBAM. And I will walk through some of them quickly now. One is that in Q2 2025, presumably that will be June, there will be Commission communication on the issue of export leakage. So the issue is, the CBAM is an instrument that applies on imports, and that may, and that will deal with carbon leakage in a broad sense. But there is a concern, a persistent concern from an environmental perspective, and also expressed by EU industry, that there may still, despite CBAM, a risk of export leakage, so a risk of carbon leakage in sectors or for products that are primarily, or that are exported. And this has been a complicated issue for, and still is, for a variety of reasons, legal reasons, technical reasons, but it's a growing demand, and therefore to propose more forthcoming solutions than the existing one to this problem. And the Commission will sketch out the way forward on this issue, specifically in a communication that is to be adopted in Q2 this year. Then comes in Q4, or I should say, maybe before I move to these two big, because several questions were more on the technical side. Until the end of the year, there are 8 or 9 implementing and delegated acts that are still to be adopted, that pertain to the verification process, the revised CBAM methodology, the benchmark, then more technical ones on customs information. So there's a variety of implementing acts that are still to come and to be adopted, and that I cannot give you more information on timeline on, but where the Commission hopes to be more, or the Commission services to be more, to provide more clarity on the timing soon as well. Then there are 2 big, sort of more politically relevant pieces that will come in Q4 this year. One is, and that was already announced for a long time, is a review report. And in this review report, we will take stock. I mean, this is a demand of co-legislators, of Council and European Parliament, to the Commission to, by the end of the transitional period, present a report with our learnings, essentially. to assess the governance, but also to assess how CBAM could evolve in the future, scope extension, for instance. We are also asked to look at progress on international level, and we are also asked to assess more granularly the impact CBAM has on least developed countries. So this will be in a report that will be published and at the end, before the end of the year, and that then should trigger a debate, I'd say, feedback certainly from Parliament and Council, but obviously from all stakeholders. And based on this, then at a later stage, the Commission will make a proposal to review and improve CBAM further. At the same time, also in Q4, we already do, and that's an acceleration of the planning, a specific proposal to extend the scope of CBAM to certain downstream products. So what are downstream products? I said earlier in the presentation that CBAM, the scope so far is primarily basic goods, so very relatively up in the supply chain, and basic goods, so to speak. Sometimes we have already the concept of complex goods, so there are a couple of goods which are using other CBAM goods as inputs, but by and large we are at a relatively basic stage on a relatively simple product that are in scope. But of course, the problem that may happen, and stakeholders already express it, if the inputs that are used to produce, for instance, a fridge or a car or so, are now under CBAM, it may happen that the risk of downstream of carbon leakage moves down the value chain. That is, that not anymore the risk materializes so much for the producers of these basic goods, but then for the people that are using these basic goods, that are sort of in the production chain, and like semi-finished products or finished products. And so the Commission will, there are risks of circumvention also. And so the Commission will make, before the end of the year, upon demand of industry, a proposal to extend the scope to certain downstream products. So products that are downstream to steel, aluminum, and possibly also cement and fertilizers. And then at a later stage, 2026 or later, the Commission will make another proposal to extend the scope also to other sectors possibly. So far we only have 6, but there are more sectors that are covered under the EU ETS, and there's a possibility, I mean, we are asked to look at the possibility to extend CBAM to chemicals, which is very complicated because of the complexity of the supply chain and the complexity also of production processes. We are asked to look at pulp, paper, ceramics, so there's a variety of sectors that are at risk of carbon leakage and under the ETS, and we are assessing, and this assessment is ongoing, and we will report about the stage of the analysis in the review report by the end of the year. And then, if deemed appropriate, the Commission will follow at a later stage, presumably in 2026, with a proposal to extend the scope also to other sectors. And that would then be also the occasion to review more fundamentally the structure of CBAM where deemed appropriate, as it concerns, for instance, governance aspects, or possibly, again, I don't want to preclude anything, but whether there's a need to find specific provisions for least developed countries. And given that CBAM is there to stay, at least for a decade or more, the environment in which CBAM operates, that is carbon prices and decarbonization efforts, is constantly evolving. It's very plausible to imagine that the ETS carbon price increases over the next years, and that would then imply possibly an increased risk of carbon leakage. Then it's plausible that globally decarbonization efforts materialize and therefore emission intensities go down. So there's a constant need to assess the functioning of CBAM, and we are tasked by co-legislators and do that every 2 years, and that would then be after 2025, then by 2027 publish a review report where we comprehensively assess the functioning of the CBAM. And that's, again, in a nutshell, or not so shall the way forward. I think I can skip these two slides in the interest of time and open the floor for questions.
Thank you, Martin. We have a few questions that came in the chat right now. Maybe I can raise to you some of them. I don't think we will be able to cover all. But then let me start from the first. Okay, from IFCM, when will be the CBAM report verification mandatory, where we can find the companies list who has authorization to do such verification in third countries?
Yes, so the verification report, I mean, this is this will only be applicable from, from emissions embedded in goods imported from 26 onwards. They will need to be verified, and that needs then to happen before the CBAM obligations to be paid. That is by summer 2027 for the year of 26. The specificities on the verification process and indeed also the relevant bodies, that's part of these implementing acts that are yet to be adopted by the Commission, that are to be published before, in the second half of the year, most likely.
Thank you. Then next question from Gregor Saler. There has been a debate to include or provide the option to include Scope 2 emissions also for sectors other than cement and fertilizers. This could be actually beneficial for exporters in countries with high levels of REs in the grid. Where does this debate stand?
Indeed, very important point. As I mentioned at some point in the presentation, so far only cement fertilizers account for indirect emissions in the form of electricity used for the production. And as part of the review report that I mentioned for Q4 2025, the Commission is asked to look specifically also on this issue, whether it's possible technically and technically possible, but also there's a dimension to it that is related to the way indirect emissions are priced in the European Union, that makes it in the sectors of steel and aluminum, that make it complicated. Anyway, so that's an issue that we clearly, that we are studying quite intensively, and that the Commission will report on, and by the end of the year, sort of give our appreciation of the issue, the complexities, but also possible way forward, and then that may be then included in a future CBAM proposal to extend the scope.
Thank you, Martin, very much. I think we don't have more time for other questions, but Thomas from ISMEA shared his email to send over to you to answer by written. So thanks for your availability also for this. So yeah, I would like to conclude the webinar by thanking you again. It has been an extremely fruitful webinar, super engagement from our participants. So thanks also to all that followed us today. I would like also to give a big thank to the ISMEA colleagues, which are behind the operational organization of this webinar, as well as all the others of this webinar series. We hope today's session helped clarify how CBAM may affect your international business activities and what you can do to prepare. A quick reminder that on the EN website, you will find all the contact details of our EN partners, so both in Europe and in many countries abroad. So SMEs can get in touch with their local business support organizations to receive personalized help and guidance completely free of charge. Finally, I would like to invite you to join us for the next webinar, which will take place on 15th of May from 10 to 11 Brussels time. The topic will be doing business in Ukraine, unlocking commercial opportunities in a challenging market environment. So in that case, we will explore the current market conditions in Ukraine and the latest economic trends relevant for European SMEs. So thanks to you all again. Thanks a lot, Martin. Really appreciate it. And have a great day. We'll see you at the next session.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you.